The days were growing warmer now, and the once frozen world outside the cabin was slowly coming back to life. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the white blanket. The air felt softer, and the cold that had dominated the long winter months was gradually loosening its grip on the land. Sarah could feel it in her bones, the change in the weather, the shift in the seasons, and it brought with it a strange sense of possibility. She had never been one to think too much about the future. In her old life, with Thomas by her side, they had lived each day with the certainty of a long shared road ahead. They had talked about their plans, their dreams of growing old together and the family they wanted to build. But since his death, Sarah had learned to live in the present, simply surviving from day to day. The future had seemed too far away, too uncertain to think about. But now, with the first signs of spring in the air and the steady rhythm of life in the cabin, Sarah began to wonder if there was still something ahead for her. The thought of a future without Thomas had always been too painful to imagine. But she was starting to see that perhaps there was still a life to live, even without him. The man whose name she still didn't know had been a constant presence in her life since that fateful day he found her in the snow. At first, she had seen him as just a stranger, someone who had saved her out of kindness or perhaps out of necessity. But as the days passed, she had come to understand that he was more than just a rescuer. He was someone who, like her, had been shaped by loss and hardship. He had withdrawn from the world, creating a life for himself in the solitude of the mountains. And though he was still a mystery in many ways, Sarah had come to trust him, to rely on him in ways she hadn't thought possible. They had grown comfortable together, though they still didn't speak much. The silence between them had become familiar, and in some ways it felt like a shared language. There were moments when words weren't necessary, when the simple act of being near each other was enough. It was a quiet companionship, one that didn't require explanation, and in that silence, Sarah had begun to heal. One afternoon, the man returned from one of his trips into the woods, a bundle of firewood over his shoulder, and a few supplies in his pack. He looked more tired than usual, his face weathered by the harsh winds and long days spent outdoors. But there was a different look in his eyes, something that caught Sarah's attention. It wasn't just the usual weary expression. There was something more, a flicker of something deeper. He set down the wood near the fire and began to arrange it, his movements purposeful. Sarah watched him for a moment, sensing that something was on his mind. She hesitated, unsure if she should ask, but finally the words came. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently, her voice soft but filled with concern. "You look different. What's on your mind?" The man paused, looking over at her. For a moment he didn't say anything, as if he were weighing his words carefully. Then with a sigh, he set down the last piece of firewood and slowly walked over to where she sat by the hearth. His eyes met hers, and this time Sarah saw something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "I don't know how long I can stay here like this, alone, with no one else around." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that. The man had always seemed so self-sufficient, so used to being on his own. She couldn't imagine him wanting anything different. But now, as she looked at him, she saw a man who was also struggling with something that had been building inside him for a long time. "I don't belong here," he continued, his voice filled with a quiet honesty. "I've built this life to keep myself safe from the past, but I'm starting to wonder if I'm just running away. Maybe it's time for me to face what's been holding me back." Sarah didn't know what to say at first. She had never heard him speak like this before, so openly about his feelings. She had always assumed that his silence was a sign of strength, a way to protect himself. But now, she realized that silence could also be a kind of prison, one that trapped him in a world of isolation. "You don't have to be alone," Sarah said softly, her words almost a whisper. "Not anymore. We're both here, and maybe we can help each other. We don't have to carry our burdens alone." The man looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared silence hanging between them. Sarah could feel the truth of her words settle in her chest. She wasn't just speaking about herself. She was speaking for both of them. They didn't have to face their pain alone. Maybe it wasn't too late for them to find a way forward together. Finally, the man nodded, his face softening just slightly. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Maybe I've been running for too long. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't known what to expect from him, but hearing him speak those words made her feel like something had shifted between them. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. It was a beginning. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the last light of day faded from the sky, the man and Sarah sat together in the quiet of the cabin. They didn't speak much more, but there was an understanding between them now, a shared recognition that things had changed. They had both been through so much, and yet here they were, standing on the edge of something new. The following days felt different, lighter somehow. The man seemed more at ease, less burdened by the weight of his past. He still kept to himself in many ways, but there was a shift in his demeanor, a subtle change that made Sarah feel like the walls he had built around himself were starting to crumble, just a little. As the days grew warmer, Sarah began to notice the small changes in herself as well. The baby inside her was growing, and though there were still moments of fear and uncertainty, she felt a sense of connection to this new life, to the possibility of the future. She had been so afraid of moving forward, so afraid of letting go of the past, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could take a step toward something new. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. Sarah and the man didn't know exactly what the future held, but they were both ready to face it together. They began to talk more, sharing bits and pieces of their past, slowly letting each other in. It wasn't fast and it wasn't without difficulty, but it was real. They didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, they both had hope. One evening, as Sarah rested by the fire, her hand on her swollen belly, she felt the baby kick, a small, reassuring movement that made her smile. She looked across the room at the man who was quietly tending to the fire, and she knew in that moment that everything could change. The future wasn't set in stone, but it was something they could shape together. As the fire crackled and the night grew quiet around them, Sarah allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, the life they were building was a new beginning. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time since her world had fallen apart, Sarah felt like she was finally moving forward, step by step, toward a future filled with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine before. As the days passed, Sarah's strength slowly returned, though she still felt weak at times. The man, whose name she still hadn't learned, continued to take care of her without question. He had built a small life for himself in the remote cabin, and though he kept mostly to himself, he showed Sarah the same quiet care he had shown when he first found her in the snow. His routine never seemed to change. He went out every day to gather firewood, hunt for food, and tend to the cabin. He was efficient, never wasting time or energy, as though he knew that every moment spent in the wilderness could be one where life was at stake. For Sarah, life in the cabin was a strange balance of stillness and quiet. She had always been someone who preferred the hustle of farm life, the constant rhythm of work and movement. But here in this small cabin, surrounded by snow and isolation, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The wind outside was the loudest sound, howling and whistling through the trees, while inside, the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the man's movements were the only things that broke the silence. The silence was something Sarah had to get used to. Back home, the sound of her husband's voice, the soft rustle of their animals, and the busy clatter of daily life had filled the house. Now there was only the quiet of the cabin, and sometimes it felt suffocating. She didn't mind the solitude at first. It was peaceful, and after everything she had been through, it was almost a relief. But as the days stretched into weeks, she began to feel the weight of the stillness. It was as if the world had become smaller, and the distance between her and everyone she had once known was growing wider. One evening, as the light from the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, Sarah sat near the hearth, wrapping her arms around her knees. The man had gone out again, as he always did, and she was left alone in the cabin. She thought about the world beyond the cabin, the town, her old life, the people she used to know. She wondered if they still remembered her. It seemed like such a long time ago that she had been a part of the world outside, so far removed from the woman she had been. Now, with her husband gone and the baby growing inside her, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. When the man returned that evening, the sun had already set, and the air was colder than usual. He brought with him a deer, a large buck which he quickly skinned and prepared. Sarah watched him with quiet fascination, admiring how effortlessly he worked. There was something almost artistic about the way he handled the knife, the way he knew exactly what to do without hesitation. He moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice, as though he had been doing this his entire life. He set the deer meat over the fire, the smell filling the cabin with a rich, smoky aroma. Sarah's stomach rumbled in response, and she realized just how hungry she was. It had been a while since she had eaten anything substantial, and the simple act of cooking meat over the fire made her feel a little more grounded, a little more connected to the world around her. The man didn't speak as he worked, but Sarah didn't mind. She had learned to appreciate the quiet. It was comforting in its own way. Still, she couldn't help but feel the need to break the silence, to try and understand this man who had taken her in without asking anything in return. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft, as she looked over at him, "about how you found me, how you ended up here." The man paused for a moment, then continued with his task. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like hesitation or perhaps reluctance. "I've been here a long time," he said finally, his voice low. "Long enough to know that asking too many questions can get you into trouble." Sarah nodded. She had no intention of pushing him, but she couldn't help her curiosity. He had saved her life, and yet there was so much about him that was a mystery. She wondered if he was running from something, or if he had simply chosen this life of solitude. "Why stay out here alone?" she asked gently, her eyes fixed on the flames. "Why not go back to the town or somewhere else?" The man paused again, his movements slow as if he were carefully considering his answer. He looked at her then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like a long while. "Sometimes it's easier to be alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "People can disappoint you, or hurt you. The more you care about someone, the more it hurts when they leave." Sarah could sense the weight in his words. It wasn't just something he said casually. It was something he had lived. His voice carried the pain of experience, and for a moment she saw something in him that mirrored her own sorrow. She wondered what had happened to him, what had made him retreat to this desolate place. But she didn't ask. She knew better than to push him. Instead, she just nodded, understanding that some things were better left unsaid. The man wasn't ready to talk, and she wasn't sure she was either. Her own pain was still too fresh, too raw to share with someone who barely knew her. She wasn't sure she was ready to open up, to tell him about Thomas, about the life she had lost. The fire crackled as they sat in silence, the only sound in the cabin the soft rustling of the flames. Sarah didn't mind it. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a small sanctuary, a moment of peace in a world that had been filled with too much noise and too many questions. As the days passed, Sarah began to feel more at ease in the cabin. She helped with small tasks around the house, sweeping the floor, mending clothes, and preparing the meals when the man was out hunting. It was a simple life, one that didn't require much thought or energy, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was living for something other than survival. She was living for the baby, for the future she still wasn't sure she was ready for, but that she was beginning to accept. The man never asked her for much, and in return she tried to help however she could. There was a strange sense of balance between them. Two people who had both experienced loss, both carried their own burdens, but who found a strange comfort in each other's presence. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. Their actions spoke louder than words ever could. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to appear in the landscape outside, Sarah found herself standing by the window, looking out over the snow-covered trees. The days were growing longer, and the cold was starting to give way to a slight warmth, the kind that hinted at the change of seasons. She felt a deep, aching loneliness in her chest as she gazed out at the world. But this time it wasn't the overwhelming kind of loneliness she had felt when Thomas had died. It was a quieter, more thoughtful kind. It was the kind of loneliness that came from being in a new place, a new chapter in her life, and not knowing where it would take her. The man entered the room quietly, as he always did, and stood beside her, looking out at the same landscape. "The winter's almost over," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sarah nodded, not sure what to say. The world was changing, and so was she. She could feel it deep inside. There was a part of her that had given up on hope, a part of her that had thought she would never be able to move forward, to heal from her grief. But now, standing there beside the man, Feeling the warmth of the fire and the first hints of spring in the air, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than surviving. Maybe there was a chance to heal, to find something new. For the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to hope again. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. Sarah remained in the cabin, resting and recovering, while the man, whose name she still didn't know, went about his routines without much explanation. She was still too weak to do anything but watch him. Her body, still adjusting to the warmth and rest, didn't feel quite like her own. The cold of the storm had taken so much from her, but now, under the steady care of this stranger, it felt like something was slowly being returned. The warmth of the fire, the hot meals he prepared, and the safety of his home were all parts of a life she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Each day, the man went out into the snowy wilderness, returning with firewood, food, and supplies. He was quiet, focused, and never spoke much about where he had come from or what brought him to this isolated place. Sarah had tried to ask a few times, but he always gave vague answers or simply didn't respond. It was clear that he didn't want to share anything about himself. Yet there was something in the way he moved, his careful attention to detail, his patience in tending to her, that made her feel like there was more to him than just a rugged loner. She wondered if he was avoiding her questions on purpose or if perhaps he had simply lost the need for words. Despite his silence, there was something comforting about the way he cared for her. He never seemed bothered by her presence, never once showed frustration or impatience. He went about his days as if it was the most natural thing in the world to take care of someone else, even if that someone was a stranger. For Sarah, it was a kindness she wasn't used to, and it made her feel more at ease than she had in weeks. One afternoon, after the snowstorm had passed and the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, the man decided to take her outside. "You need to get some air," he said simply, helping her to her feet. His voice was soft but firm, and there was a gentleness in the way he looked at her, though his face remained mostly unreadable. Sarah hadn't been outside since her arrival. She had been too weak to venture out, and the thought of facing the cold, vast world again made her uneasy. But something in the man's tone made her feel that this was something she needed to do. Slowly, she stepped outside, clutching her blanket around her shoulders. The air was crisp, but the sun, though faint, was a welcome relief. She had forgotten how beautiful the world could be after a snowstorm. The landscape, covered in a thick layer of fresh snow, glistened as if it were made of diamonds. The trees, weighed down with snow, stood tall and still, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms against the clear blue sky. The world felt still, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah stood there for a moment, taking it all in, feeling the warmth of the sunlight against her skin. It was a strange feeling, this sense of quiet peace after all the chaos. The man, as usual, said little as he stood beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. His posture was tense, as though he was always on alert, always watching for something. Sarah wondered what kind of life he had led to make him so wary, so guarded. But she didn't ask. Instead, she simply enjoyed the moment of peace, the brief respite from the storm of her own life. They spent a few minutes outside, walking slowly through the snow, Sarah's legs still shaky from her time spent resting. The man didn't rush her. He walked beside her, his steps sure and steady, and for a brief moment it almost felt like they were just two people, out for a quiet stroll in the wilderness. There was no hurry, no sense of urgency. It was a rare moment of calm in a world that had been anything but calm for so long. As they walked, Sarah's mind wandered again to her own situation. She thought of the life she had left behind, the farm, the memories of her husband, the small dreams they had shared. She wondered what had become of the house, of the farm, of everything she had worked so hard for. It all seemed so far away now, as if it belonged to someone else, to a version of her that no longer existed. She didn't know if she would ever go back, if there was even a reason to. Her thoughts were interrupted when the man stopped walking and turned to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. Sarah was surprised by the question. It wasn't something she had expected. She had grown used to his silence, to his unspoken care, but hearing him ask about her well-being made her realize that, in his own way, he was concerned. I'm better," she said, her voice a little weak. "I don't know if I'll ever feel like myself again, but—" She paused, thinking. "It's just hard, you know? Everything feels different now." The man nodded, his gaze distant as he looked out over the snow-covered landscape. "I understand," he said quietly. "Sometimes things change and you have no choice but to adapt. But that doesn't mean it's easy." Sarah was taken aback by his words. She had expected him to say something cold or dismissive, but instead, he had shown a kind of understanding that she hadn't anticipated. She looked at him for a moment, trying to figure him out, but once again, he seemed like a puzzle that couldn't be solved. He wasn't like anyone she had known before. He was quiet, reserved, but there was something in him that spoke of experience, of a past filled with its own trials and burdens. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a shared understanding, a mutual recognition of the hardships they had both faced. Sarah didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. There was no pressure to explain herself, no need to justify her pain. The man didn't expect anything from her, and that was a relief in itself. They returned to the cabin after a while, and the man went about his usual routine, chopping more firewood, preparing the cabin for the coming night. Sarah sat by the fire watching him work. She had no idea what drove him to live like this, isolated in the wilderness far from the rest of the world, but she was beginning to understand that he had chosen this life. Just as she had once chosen to stay on her farm, working alongside her husband. She thought about asking him about his past, about what had led him to this remote place, but something told her it wasn't the right time. He would share when he was ready if he ever decided to, and maybe that was the way it had to be. As the night drew near, the man prepared a meal, and Sarah found herself once again grateful for the small things. The food was simple, but it was nourishing, and the warmth of the cabin made her feel safe. She could hear the wind howling outside, the snow continuing to fall in soft drifts, but inside it was peaceful. That night, as Sarah lay in the makeshift bed, she felt a sense of something she hadn't felt in a long time: comfort. It wasn't a grand feeling, nor was it the kind of joy she had once known. But it was enough. For the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to simply rest. There was no need to worry about the past, about what had been lost. For now she was safe. For now she could breathe. The man's presence, though still largely a mystery, was a comfort to her. She didn't know how long they would be together, or what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a chance to heal, a chance to move forward, even if it was only one small step at a time. And as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day lift from her shoulders. In the silence of the cabin with the man nearby, she allowed herself to dream of what might lie ahead, of a future that, though uncertain, was no longer as impossible as it had seemed. The ride back to the man's cabin was long and quiet, the only sound being the steady clop of the horse's hooves against the snow. Sarah was too exhausted to speak, too weak to do anything but hold on as the man guided the horse through the thick snowstorm. The air was bitterly cold, and each gust of wind felt like needles against her skin. But there was something about the way he rode, his steady movements, that gave her a small sense of security. She was no longer alone in the vast empty wilderness. The man didn't say much during the ride. He had helped her onto the horse without a word, his hands firm and strong but gentle enough not to cause her pain. He hadn't asked her name, nor had she asked his. There was an understanding between them, a quiet agreement that words weren't needed in this moment. They were both survivors, two souls caught in a world that had shown them nothing but hardship. The snowstorm howled around them, but for the first time in what felt like ages, Sarah didn't feel like the storm would swallow her whole. As the minutes passed, Sarah's mind wandered back to the time before everything had gone wrong. She thought of her husband, Thomas, the man she had once dreamed of growing old with. She remembered the way he had laughed, his eyes bright with hope for their future. It had been so easy to believe in that future when he was by her side. But now she was alone, and the weight of that loneliness settled heavily in her chest. It was hard not to feel bitter, not to wish that things had turned out differently, but she couldn't afford to dwell on those feelings right now. She had to survive. She had to find a way to keep going, for the sake of the child growing inside her. The baby was the only thing that had kept her moving forward, even when the world around her seemed intent on crushing her spirit. Finally, after what felt like hours, the man guided the horse toward a small cabin nestled between a cluster of trees. The cabin was rough and simple, but it looked warm, and that was all that mattered to Sarah at the moment. Her body was exhausted, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones. She was beyond grateful to have found shelter, even if it was in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. The man dismounted and helped Sarah off the horse. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and for a moment she thought she might fall. But he steadied her, guiding her inside the cabin. The warmth hit her like a wave, the heat from the fire in the hearth wrapping around her like a blanket. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt such warmth, such comfort. It was as though she had stepped out of one world and into another, a world where survival was possible, where hope hadn't completely died. Inside the cabin, the man helped her sit down near the fire. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the heat of the fire sink into her bones. It was a relief to be off her feet, to finally rest after what had felt like an endless struggle against the elements. The man went about his tasks in silence, moving with a quiet confidence as he stoked the fire and prepared a simple meal. Sarah watched him, still too weak to do much of anything. She wasn't sure what to make of him. His silence made him seem distant, but there was something in the way he moved, in the way he cared for her without saying a word, that suggested he wasn't entirely indifferent to her suffering. He wasn't the kind of man who offered false comfort, but there was a steadiness in his actions, a kind of quiet strength that she couldn't help but notice. When the food was ready, he set a bowl in front of her. Sarah was too hungry to refuse, and though the meal was simple, just stew with a few vegetables, she ate it gratefully. It was the first real food she had had in days, and it warmed her from the inside out. As she ate, the man sat across from her, watching her quietly. His expression unreadable, it was strange. The way they sat together, two strangers, each with their own scars and burdens, yet bound by the same circumstances. Neither of them spoke much, but somehow words didn't feel necessary. The man was content to let the silence stretch between them, and Sarah was too exhausted to break it. After she finished eating, she leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders begin to ease just a little. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the warmth of the cabin seemed to chase away the chill that had settled in her body. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe, or at least as safe as she could be in the presence of someone she didn't know. But there was no sense of danger from this man, no sense of threat. Instead, there was an odd, unspoken understanding between them. He had helped her when no one else had, and for that she was grateful. The man stood up and began to move around the cabin, his movements slow and purposeful. Sarah couldn't help but watch him, trying to figure out who he was. He was tall, with rough features that spoke of a hard life. His face was weathered, the kind of face that had seen too much. His clothes were worn, patched up in places, and he carried himself with a kind of quiet authority. There was something about him that reminded her of a person who had been through hell and had come out the other side, scarred but stronger for it. He didn't seem like the kind of man who was used to sharing his life with others. His solitude seemed to suit him, like it was a choice, not just a circumstance. There was a hardness in his eyes, a guardedness that made it clear he wasn't willing to let anyone get too close. But there was also something else, something beneath the surface, something that suggested he hadn't always been this way. Maybe once, a long time ago, he had been different. Maybe he had known love and loss just as she had. Sarah's curiosity got the best of her, and she finally spoke, her voice soft but filled with a quiet determination. "Why are you helping me?" The man paused for a moment, as if the question caught him off guard. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over at her, his eyes searching her face as though weighing whether or not to speak. Then, after a long moment of silence, he replied, his voice rough but honest. "I don't know," he said simply. "I saw you out there. I couldn't leave you." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. There was more to it. She could feel it, but she wasn't going to push him. Not now, when she was so fragile, so close to breaking. The man turned back to his work, preparing a place for her to rest. He handed her a blanket, and for the first time since she had arrived, Sarah felt her eyelids growing heavy. The warmth from the fire, the food in her stomach, and the safety of the cabin were too much for her to resist. She lay down on the makeshift bed the man had set up for her, curling under the blanket, her body surrendering to exhaustion. Before she closed her eyes, she heard him move around the cabin, his steps purposeful but quiet. There was no more conversation, no more questions. Only silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people, though strangers, are simply content to exist in the same space. to share the same moment, without needing to explain themselves. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, she felt a small flicker of hope stir in her heart. The world was still harsh, the winter still unforgiving, but she wasn't completely alone anymore. She had been found, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could make it through this storm after all. The world around Sarah seemed to stretch endlessly, a cold, bleak landscape where the snow fell in endless sheets, as if trying to bury her along with the memories of her lost husband. The wind howled through the trees, the branches creaking like the groans of some unseen giant. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but the cold still gnawed at her bones. Every step she took in the deep snow felt heavier than the last, and yet she pushed forward. What else could she do? Sarah had been a married woman once, full of hope and promise. She and Thomas had dreamed of a life full of joy and children, their little farm becoming a place of warmth and laughter. But that dream had shattered in an instant when her husband had died in a terrible accident. It had been sudden, unexpected, and devastating. One moment he had been working on the farm, his smile bright as he spoke of plans for the future. The next, the scream of his horse and the crash of his body against the ground shattered her world. She had tried to stay strong, for the sake of the child growing inside her. But it wasn't easy. Each day without him felt like a long, endless night. His absence was everywhere, in the empty spaces of their home, in the silence of the fields, in the way the wind seemed to whisper his name. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that the world had somehow become a little smaller, a little colder, without him. Winter had come early that year. The snow piled high, blocking the roads, making it impossible for anyone to reach her farm. Her neighbors were far away, and though they had promised to help, she hadn't seen any sign of them for weeks. There was no food left in the house, no firewood to keep the hearth warm, and her strength was running out. Each day was harder than the last, and she felt as though the snow would soon claim her, just as it had claimed so much else. She had known deep down that she couldn't stay there any longer. Her hope was fading like the light of a dying fire, and she knew that if she didn't act soon, she and the baby would not survive. With her last bit of strength, she decided to leave the house behind and make her way toward the nearest town. It was a dangerous decision, one she knew might lead to her own death, but what else was left? The thought of dying alone in the house without anyone to find her was too much to bear. If she had to die, she would rather face it on the road, perhaps with someone else to witness her passing. The snow was deep, and with each step, she sank further into the white world. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one leaving a small cloud in the freezing air. She tried to focus on her destination, but the cold and fatigue made her head swim. The baby inside her moved, a soft reminder of the life still clinging to her. She didn't want to give up. She couldn't give up, not yet. But then the world around her began to blur. The cold gnawed at her skin, her limbs becoming stiff and unresponsive. She stumbled, her foot catching on a rock buried beneath the snow. With a cry of pain, she fell to the ground, her hands desperately trying to brace herself against the freezing earth. Her fingers, numb and stiff, could barely hold on. She felt the ground give way beneath her as her strength finally gave out. The last thing she remembered was the cold air filling her lungs and the dark sky above, clouded with snow. She had hoped someone would find her, but deep inside she knew it was unlikely. She had made the decision to leave the house, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly the elements would take their toll. She was lost in the snow, and the storm was beginning to close in on her. The hours passed, and the wind howled through the trees. The snow continued to fall, covering her and the world in a blanket of white. Sarah's body lay still, her breath slow and shallow, her eyes closed in a kind of half-sleep. She didn't know how long she had been there, but it felt like an eternity. Her body was numb, and the pain from her fall had dulled into something she could hardly feel. She could almost imagine Thomas's voice calling her name, telling her that everything would be all right. But it was just a memory, fleeting and distant. She had almost drifted into unconsciousness when the sound of hooves reached her ears. At first she thought it was part of the dream where Thomas was still alive and everything was the way it had been before. But the sound grew louder, and then she felt something, a presence near her. A shadow moved over her, blocking the snow and the wind. A figure appeared, blurry at first, then clearer. A man, tall and rugged, with the unmistakable look of someone who had lived a hard life. He was dressed in a long coat, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. For a moment, Sarah thought she might be hallucinating. Maybe death had come for her, and this man was nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But then, the man reached down and touched her arm, and she could feel the warmth of his hand through the numbness of her skin. "Miss," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Are you all right?" She tried to speak, but no words came out. She opened her mouth, but only a ragged breath escaped. She felt his hand on her shoulder, lifting her gently, and the world spun around her. She was so weak, so tired. Everything in her body screamed for rest, but the man wasn't giving up. He seemed to know exactly what to do. He hoisted her up, and though her legs were like jelly, she tried to stand. "You're lucky I found you," the man said, more to himself than to her. "What were you thinking, wandering out here in this storm?" The words were like a lifeline. Sarah's mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that. With concern, with care. She had been alone for so long, surrounded by nothing but the cold and the emptiness. Now there was this stranger, someone who cared enough to stop, to help. His voice was low, yet it carried a weight, a sense of experience Sarah couldn't quite place. The way he spoke made her think he had seen hardship, had lived through pain just like her. Maybe he understood in some strange way what it felt like to lose everything. The man gently lifted her onto his horse, settling her carefully behind him. She tried to hold on, but her hands felt like they belonged to someone else. As he guided the horse back through the snow, Sarah's thoughts were a blur. She was too weak to process everything, too tired to understand why this stranger was helping her. All she could do was lean against him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. The snowstorm raged around them, but Sarah no longer felt completely alone. The man's presence, although mysterious, was a comfort. She had no idea who he was or why he had found her. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't completely lost after all.